The air in the riverlands had grown colder, heavier. War left nothing untouched, fields once golden with barley, now soaked with blood, and the cries of crows were the only songs that lingered in the wind. But inside Riverrune's stone walls, the young king in the north, Robb Stark, prepared not for battle, but for a wedding. Robb stood before the mirror, adjusting the dark grey tunic that bore the direwolf of House Stark. His face was tired, older than his years, with a heaviness in his eyes that hadn't been there when he first rode south. Catelyn Stark sat quietly beside the fire, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She watched her son without speaking. "She's not Talisa," Robb said quietly, not turning to face his mother. "No," Catelyn replied gently, "but she is a Frey, and you gave your word." Robb nodded. That was what it came down to. His honor, his father had lived by it, died by it, even, and Robb had seen what breaking vows brought fractures in alliances, whispers of betrayal, and a dozen lords wondering if their king's word meant anything at all. He had fallen for Talisa Mega, the foreign healer from Volantis. She had saved him more than once, but love was a luxury Robb Stark could no longer afford. Not after the death of his father, not while the Lannisters still held Sansa, and certainly not while Walder Frey watched from the twins with a growing list of slights and offences. The wedding took place with haste and grim necessity. The halls of the twins were no place for joy. The Freys, dozens of them, each less pleasant than the last, smirked and strutted about like peacocks. Lord Walder himself looked like he'd bitten into something sour. His voice croaked as he declared the union binding, though his eyes never smiled. Rosalind Frey was quiet and pale, with a voice soft as snow. She looked terrified, barely glancing at Robb as they exchanged vows. Robb was kind to her, but there was no lovingly, a bitter resignation. The room clapped, and music played, but no one danced. Even the wine tasted like ashes. But the marriage worked. The North and the Riverlands stayed united. Lord Walder, bitter and mean-spirited as ever, honoured his pact. The Red Wedding never came. The Freys kept their gates open, their swords pointed at the Lannisters instead of their guests. Robb's army grew stronger, not smaller. It was a strange victory, and yet whispers remained. Rumours swirled that Robb had nearly broken his vow, that a foreign girl had turned his head. Some called him weak for backing down, others called him wise for avoiding bloodshed. But Robb carried both burdens like armour. He had kept his vow, but at what cost? Talisa had left Riverrun quietly before the wedding, her eyes dry but her heart shattered. Catelyn had watched her go, said nothing, but felt the loss deep in her bones. Love was not for kings, not in war. The next months brought more fighting, but the tide began to turn. With the Freys' support, Robb's army crushed the remnants of Lannister forces along the Green Fork. Jaime Lannister remained imprisoned, and the Karstarks, though angrier, stayed loyal, with no scandal to stir their rebellion. But the North was tired. Robb felt it. Each battle gained him land, but cost him brothers, uncles, sons of Bannermen. He sat late into the nights in the war room, hunched over maps, his hand running through his hair like his father once did. Rosalind, for her part, was dutiful. She bore Robb a son within the year. The North celebrated, and Lord Walder gloated like a man who had won some secret game. The boy was named Eddard after his grandfather. But even in the cradle, there was a quiet unease around the child. He was the symbol of peace, but not of love. Catelyn held her grandson in her arms and wept. She did not know why. Perhaps for Ned. Perhaps for Robb, who had chosen duty over heart. or perhaps because she feared the storm was only delayed, not avoided. One night, as snow fell quietly outside the windows of Riverrun, Robb sat alone with John Umber and Grey John, drinking strong ale and staring at the fire. "You did the right thing, lad," Grey John muttered, slamming his mug on the table. "You kept your word, that matters." Robb nodded, but said nothing. The fire crackled, throwing shadows across his face. He had saved his kingdom. But something inside him had died the day he married Rosalind Frey. Months passed. The North and Riverlands stood united, but peace was a thin layer of ice over deep, troubled waters. Robb Stark, though victorious in battle and steady in his throne, had not grown into the king his people needed. He had grown tired, too quiet. And behind every smile of House Frey, there was something sour, something waiting. Rosalind did her duty as queen. She was never a source of drama, never raised her voice, never questioned her husband. That, in itself, was part of the problem. There was no warmth in her eyes, only polite silence. Robb rarely visited her chambers unless duty called, and when he did, he left quickly, distracted. The lords began to whisper not of rebellion, but of doubt. Robb's heart still beats. For the Valentine girl, Lord Roose Bolton said quietly during a council at Harrenhal, "Duty without desire makes for a fragile crown." Catelyn had returned to Riverrun, growing colder with the war. She had lost too much: her husband, her daughters, even her peace. She watched Robb command armies, sign letters, and name bannermen, but she never saw him smile any more. He was a boy forced to be a king in a world that punished softness. Then came the raven from the Vale. Lysa Arryn, ever paranoid, had denied Robb safe passage through the mountains, but she had agreed under pressure to host Sansa Stark. It was Sansa's letters that brought new anxiety to Robb. She wrote with coded phrases. Careful language, but it was clear the Lannisters were closing in. Tyrion had forced her into marriage. She feared for her life. Robb clenched the letter in his fist. "She's still my sister," he said to Catelyn, the firelight dancing on his steel breastplate, "and I will not let her rot in King's Landing." But there were problems. Marching on the capital required strength they didn't have. The Reach still backed the Lannisters. Tywin had no intention of letting Robb gain another inch. And, most troubling of all, Roose Bolton, silent and calculating, had begun to distance himself from the Stark cause. Roose sent fewer ravens. He arrived late to councils, and when he did appear, he was cold and unreadable. Catelyn warned her son, but Robb shrugged it off. He's always been like that. But men like Roose did not stay neutral forever. They waited, then chose the winning side. Then came the rumor. A quiet, deadly whisper passed between taverns and camps, that Talisa Magahum, many believed to be gone, had not returned to Volantis, that she still lingered, hidden in the Riverlands, under the protection of a few loyal northern soldiers, that Robb visited her once, briefly, after a skirmish in Seaguard. The rumor reached Walder Frey, and Walder did not forget. At a feast celebrating young Eddard Stark's first name day, the Freys arrived at Riverrun, uninvited but smiling, bearing gifts and toasts. Walder's sons and grandsons drank heavily, laughed too loud, praised the king too eagerly. Robb noticed, so did his mother, but they said nothing. Later that night, in the quiet of the Godswood, Robb found Rosalind crying. Her hands trembled. "My father thinks. He thinks you've betrayed me." Robb froze. "I haven't. I never touched her after the wedding." "I swore. I believe you," Rosalind whispered, her face pale as snow. "But my father doesn't care about truth. He cares about insult. Robb paced, hands on his hips. I married into his family. I gave up love for duty. What more does he want? Roslin looked up at him. He wants to be feared. He wants to matter. He wants to remind you that even though you're a king, you're not untouchable. The fire in Robb's chest burned hot that night. He summoned his council. Great John Blackfish, Lord Manderley. They all urged caution. Don't provoke the Freys. Don't give Walder a reason to break faith. But Robb was done being patient. He wrote to Walder Frey himself. It was not a threat, but it was a warning. I have honored my vow, treated your daughter with respect, and secured your place in the new kingdom of the North. But let it be known, AMA Stark of Winter. My father was Ned Stark. If any harm comes to my wife, my son, or my kingdom from your hands, the twins will drown in blood. He sealed the letter with ice and sent it by raven. The days after that were quiet, too quiet. No reply came. No Freys returned to the twins. And in the distance, beyond the green fields and muddy roads of the Riverlands, something old and cold began to stir. Not all enemies wore lions on their breasts. Some wore smiles, and waited. The Northman's letter reached the twins in the dead of night, carried by a raven with wings like shadow. Walder Frey read it slowly, twice over, his thin lips twisting into something between a sneer and a smirk. Around him, the fire burned low, casting deep lines on his wrinkled face. A threat, he croaked, tossing the parchment onto the hearth. From a boy playing at king. Black Walder chuckled. He forgets whose walls kept his army from drowning in the south. No, Lord Walder said, his voice like gravel. He remembers. That's the problem. That's why he thinks he can scare us. But it wasn't fear Robb sought. It was warning. And even if Lord Walder didn't fear Robb Stark, he now saw something else to fight. The young wolf had teeth. And worse still, pride. The insult had not passed. It had only been delayed. Walder Frey never let things go. He just waited until the knife could be slipped in quietly, where no one could stop it. Back at Riverrun, Robb sat in war council again, his face taut with frustration. Every day brought a new delay. The men of the North were growing restless. Lord Karstark murmured that the real war was being lost not on the battlefield, but in letters and whispers. Roose Bolton arrived 2 days late, his expression as unreadable as ever. He greeted Robb with a bow so shallow it might as well have been mockery. You rode through the Dreadfort on your way here. Robb asked him. I did, Roose answered smoothly. All is calm for now. Robb watched him closely. Something in Roose had shifted. He was no longer a bannerman offering counsel. He was a man waiting to choose a side. The uneasy truth gnawed at Robb. The war was no longer just against the Lannisters. It was also about holding together his own people. And that he was learning was harder. The army needed movement. So Robb ordered it south again. They would march toward Moat Cailin, secure the neck, and pressure the Boltons into firm loyalty. The plan was bold, but necessary. The war could not be won by silence and stillness. Before they left, Catelyn approached her son in his chambers. She held a small bundle wrapped in wolfskin. Young Eddard, barely a year old, with eyes like grey steel. He has your look, she said, her voice low. Robb took the child in his arms and stared down. The weight in his chest tightened. He'd fought battles, seen friends die, ordered men to their deaths. But this small boy frightened him more than any of it. Not because of what he was, but because of what he might never get to see. I don't want him raised by lords and ravens, Robb muttered. I want him to know Winterfell. I want him to know snow and wolves and the old gods. Catelyn touched his arm. Then win and come back. The army rode out the next morning. A sea of grey cloaks, banners of the direwolf and trout flapping in the wind. As they passed through the green fields toward the neck, they drew, eyes watchful, silent. In the shadows of the trees, scouts whispered of strange movements. Men dressed as sellswards moved through the woods. Campfires that vanished before anyone could reach them. Disguises, decoys. Robb ordered more patrols. Then came the dagger. In the dark, on a stormy night near Maidenpool, as the king's tent lay quiet and the guards rotated their watch, a man slipped past the sentries dressed in northern garb. The blade reached for Robb's throat, too silent, too quick. But Grey Wind was faster. The direwolf leaped from the corner, teeth flashing, and tore the would-be assassin apart in seconds. Blood splattered across Robb's chest, and when the chaos settled, the man lay twitching, a crimson mess. They searched him, no house sigil, no personal effects, but in his boot a folded parchment sealed with wax, and marked by the flayed man of House Bolton. Roose denied it, of course. Anyone can forge a seal, he said coolly, standing in the torchlit war tent. A trap to turn you against me. Robb stared him down, breathing heavy. You think I'm that stupid? He asked, voice quiet. I think you're desperate, Roose replied. And desperation breeds mistakes. Robb almost drew his sword right there, but something held him back. Maybe it was Catelyn's face, the memory of his father's calm judgment. Or maybe it was the small cry of his son echoing from the tent beside him. He didn't kill Roose Bolton that night, but he should have, because Walder Frey had already written to the Dreadfort, and Roose Bolton had already answered. The march through the neck was colder than expected, the winds cutting through armor like thin knives. The mud slowed the horses, and the soldiers trudged with heavy boots and heavier thoughts. Every step southward carried the stench of something unseen. Fear, doubt, treason. Robb rode ahead most days, Grey Wind at his side. The direwolf had become more aggressive since the assassination attempt. He growled at shadows, lunged at anyone who moved too quickly. Robb didn't blame him. He felt it too, that sense that every face around him might be hiding a blade. The letter from the assassin's boot still burned in his mind. Roose Bolton had offered no real explanation, just smooth words and icy glances. Yet Robb had kept him alive. He told himself it was strategy. Killing Roose might fracture the North even further, might push the Boltons openly into Tywin's lap. But deep down, Robb knew it was fear. Not of Roose, but of making the same mistake his father made. Acting too late, trusting too long. At Moat Cailin, they set camp for 2 weeks. Robb summoned every bannerman who had not yet bent the knee again since his marriage. It was a show of strength and a test of loyalty. Most came. Wyman Manderley arrived with a small force, eyes watchful but respectful. Lord Chowen sent his sons. Even Galbart Glover, wounded and worn, made the journey from Deepwood Motte, but no raven came from the Dreadfort. Roose Bolton had disappeared. He's not in the north anymore, Catelyn said as she examined a map in the war tent. If he fled Moat Cailin, he's riding south. To King's Landing, Robb muttered. Bitterly, to power, she corrected, wherever it lies. Robb pounded his fist on the table. I should have gutted him when I had the chance. And then what? His men turn on you. Half the north splits again. You've kept this kingdom together, with thread and breath. You think one drop of blood would fix that? No, Robb said, but it might have been honest. That night, a raven arrived not from the Dreadfort, but from the twins. Rosalind Frey had been taken ill. Gravely, the maester wrote, a fever that would not break, and no remedy that worked. She asked for Robb. She begged for her husband to come. The letter made Robb's chest ache in a way he didn't expect. He had not loved Rosalind, not truly, but she was his wife, the mother of his son, and for all the coldness between them, she had never once betrayed him. I have to go, he told his mother. You can't, she replied, voice trembling. It's a trap, I know, he said, but I have to go anyway. Catelyn stared at him, eyes full of something between horror and helplessness. If you step into the twins again, you will not walk out. I'll take 500 of my best men. Grey Wind, the Blackfish. I'll march in, I'll take my wife and child, and I'll ride back out. We won't dine, we won't talk. We go in and we go out. Catelyn shook her head slowly. You think you can outmaneuver Walder Frey in his own den? Robb looked her dead in the eyes. I don't think I can afford not to. 2 days later, they reached the edge of Frey territory. Robb left the bulk of his forces stationed behind, setting camp on the banks of the Green Fork. He rode with only the most loyal Blackfish, Great John, Seer Ryman, and his personal guard. The gates of the twins creaked open like the maw of some old beast. Freys lined the walls, staring down like vultures waiting on a battlefield. Lord Walder did not greet them. Instead, Lothar Frey stepped forward, bowing low. Welcome home, Your Grace, he said with a smile that didn't touch his eyes. Lady Rosalind awaits you. The halls were eerily quiet. No feasting, no music, just the sound of bootsteps echoing off stone. Robb found Rosalind in her chambers, pale but alive. Her fever was real. Her eyes lit up when she saw him, tears spilling down her cheeks. You came, she whispered. Of course I did, Robb replied softly, brushing damp hair from her forehead. But even as he held her hand, he felt the wrongness in the air, the silence, the sense of being watched. And outside, in the cold courtyard, a raven launched into the sky, wings slicing through the wind, carrying a single message westward. The wolf is in the trap. Robb Stark stood by Rosalind's bedside for hours, waiting for her breathing to steady. He bathed her forehead, whispered soft reassurances, and allowed himself, just for a moment, to forget where he was. But beneath the tenderness, something cold wrapped itself around his spine. The twins were too quiet. Walder Frey hadn't shown himself. There had been no feast, no pretense of hospitality. The corridors were lined with guards, and none of them smiled. Even Lothar Frey had vanished. After leading them in, Blackfish stood watch outside Rosalind's door with 3 hand-picked men, his hand never leaving his sword hilt. Something's wrong, Blackfish muttered. There's not a single drunk Frey stumbling through the hall, not even a bard playing for the sick queen. Robb nodded. He's waiting. For what? The Blackfish asked. Robb didn't answer. Instead, he turned back to Rosalind. Her fever had broken slightly, but she was still weak, her lips cracked, her eyes half closed. She clutched his hand like a drowning girl. I think they're going to kill you, she whispered, so faint he almost didn't hear it. Robb's heart froze. Who? My father, Lothar, maybe even Roose. I don't know, but something's happening. He squeezed her hand. I know, we're getting you and the baby out of here tonight. Blackfish had already begun the preparations. Horses were saddled quietly in the stables. A secret path along the western wall had been discovered, an old servant's route leading toward the river. The plan was simple: slip out during the third watch, ride hard for the camp, and regroup before the Freys could react. But Walder Frey had not built his reputation on kindness, and he had not grown old by being careless. Just after midnight, as the winds howled through the towers, the trap was sprung. It began with the sound of hooves, hundreds surrounding the outer camp, hidden in the darkness. Robb's forces, half of whom had been left behind, were caught in their tents, many of them drunk or sleeping. Arrows rained down like locusts. Fires broke out. Panic spread like rot. Inside the twins, a horn blew. Doors slammed shut. Locks clicked into place. The Freys emerged from the shadows, swords drawn, armor glinting in the torchlight. Lothar Frey led the charge into the hall where Blackfish and the guards waited. Steel met steel in a chaotic burst. One of Robb's men fell instantly. Another screamed as a spear tore through his side. Blackfish bellowed, "Get the king out, Robb!" Burst from Roslyn's chamber, sword in hand, grey wind snarling beside him. Blood smeared the floor already. A Frey came at him. Robb cut him down without a second thought. Grey wind lunged into the hallway, ripping out a throat. "Roslyn, stay here," Robb shouted, his voice desperate. "Hide, don't make a sound." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Take our son, please." Robb scooped up the sleeping boy and ran. The halls were chaos. Screams, footsteps, death. Great John Umber was fighting in the main corridor, hacking Freys apart with a fury few had ever seen. But even he was outnumbered. Blackfish grabbed Robb's arm. The stables now. They sprinted through the back corridor, grey wind clearing a path ahead. Behind them, the remaining loyalists followed or tried. Many didn't make it. The Freys were everywhere, at the stables. The horses were already saddled. But more Freys had arrived, blocking the gate. Arrows flew. One grazed Robb's shoulder. He didn't even flinch. He thrust the child into Blackfish's arms. "Take him, ride. Don't stop." Blackfish hesitated for the first time. "No, go." Grey wind attacked the archers, scattering them. Blackfish mounted, holding the baby tight. He turned once, met Robb's eyes, then spurred the horse into a gallop. Robb turned back toward the gates. He didn't plan to run. He knew what this was now. A reckoning. Roose Bolton stepped from the shadows then, calm as ever, wearing the red-flayed man of his house like a badge of pride. "King Robb," he said smoothly. "You traitorous son of a bitch," Robb spat. Roose shrugged. The North remembers many things, but it forgets who really wins wars. They fought then, sword against sword, sparks flying in the dark. Robb was faster, angrier, but Roose was cold and precise. A slice across Robb's leg, another across his side. Robb fell to one knee. Grey wind leapt, but a dozen bolts struck him mid-air. The great direwolf yelped, staggered, then collapsed with a growl that turned into a whimper. Robb's scream tore through the night. Roose stood over him. Blood splattered across his armor. "The Lannisters send their regards," he whispered, but just before he struck, an arrow pierced Roose's shoulder from above. Blackfish from the parapet. Somehow he had turned back. Behind him, more Chaos Greatjohn was still fighting, and several northern soldiers had begun a desperate push. Roose stumbled back. Robb lunged up, stabbed once, twice driving his blade deep into Bolton's side. The traitor gasped, staggered and fell, but Robb was bleeding too much. His strength failed him. He dropped beside Grey Wind, his hand resting on the wolf's still warm fur. Outside, the gate shattered open. Blackfish returned for his king. But would it be in time?